So, good afternoon, Pat. Welcome to Share Green Design podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here. So, thank you for accepting our invite. And if you'd like to start introducing yourself, please, and give us a bit of background about when you started your career and how you got involved and interested in sustainability, please.
Thanks, Juan, and thanks for having me on your podcast. I suppose I started to take an interest in. I studied architecture, probably finished in 1990, and like a lot of people, I would have worked in a couple of countries across Europe for the first couple of years, and sustainability was something at the back of my mind, and I was probably thinking more around resource consumption in the early days, as something that seemed to be an issue, possibly more than um, carbon. Um, and I suppose I did realize that there was a gap in my knowledge in my early career. So I went back, did a master's in Cardiff in environmental design and buildings, and that really brought home to me, the scale of the challenge, and that was back in about 2002. Um, so it was really from there I realized I couldn't go back to just practicing as an architect as normal. That there was so much, really, it was clear back then that we had to make a rapid transition and we needed to move to net zero carbon. So I suppose I found it quite challenging working in commercial practices because, well, there was an awareness. There were certain things you could do as an architect. Like if you suggested, well, we really need to make this more sustainable. Well, clients would generally agree with that. Say, oh yes, we should be green. But then when it comes down to practical implementation, um, first of all, it could be quite difficult to demonstrate it. It could be quite difficult to actually um, verify. But quite often, that when it came down to additional cost, there was less enthusiasm. But I found that you could always generally integrate sustainability, and sometimes just by keeping quiet about it, there were lots of things you could just integrate into a design without necessarily informing the client. Um, and I think
Mhm.
that was really important. So I suppose I began to realize that you know one of the challenges was the more you thought about it, the more difficult it became because you're thinking about different materials, and there wasn't really a lot of information back in the noughties on materials, and you were kind of weighing up one material against another, but there was no real kind of hard evidence. There was no kind of there was a huge amount of greenwashing going on, so it was really quite difficult. And I thought it would be really great if somebody sorted all of this out, um, and actually provided a clear way of assessing materials and buildings. So I suppose that started some of the journey for me. You know, because I suppose I like working as a designer, but I felt I couldn't really enjoy that process if I didn't know what the impact of what I was doing was on the environment. So,
I think that's very interesting, Pat. Sorry to interrupt there. I think that's very interesting. And what you said earlier about a gap in your knowledge. So accepting that we don't know everything we should know, I think it's the best starting point, isn't it? So having that, and if we were all in that line of thought and accepting, and it's a continuous learning, isn't it? So because I guess you're still learning
yeah,
every day.
absolutely. I mean, in fact, it's very hard to keep up with everything. You know, the amount of change that is taking place, the more you learn, the more you need to delve into, issues like circularity or whole life carbon. But I suppose one of the reasons to set up the Irish Green Building Council was that as an architect, you can influence one or two buildings at a time, but all you really I felt that we really needed to move upstream and just influence the key policy, the decision makers, the clients, the people who actually influence what architects do. Um, and you often hear architects say, um, I'll do anything the client asks me to do. If he wants a green building, he'll get a green building. And I suppose that can be a little bit cynical, but that's the reality. A client can get anything he wants if he asks for it.
And how was your how were your beginnings at the IGBC? How was it about setting it up? I don't know how many years ago, and how difficult did you find it? And there were did you get enough traction at the beginning? Because I guess it wasn't an easy start.
But I suppose this was we started um, the very first um, concept was probably in late 2009. I said, "Yeah, we really should do this." It was probably the worst possible time in the Irish construction sector. 2009 is just the complete collapse in construction. Um, I think about 50% of architects were laid off. Um, the construction sector had gone from something like 270,000 employed in construction down to 150 or 160,000. So everybody was under immense pressure. And so actually, it was quite a surprisingly, we were going around, we talked initially, I think, with the RIAI, a couple of organizations about setting up a green building council. And actually, we got a reasonably good response by going to companies that we thought might be interested. Um, so initially, I think we launched in 2011 with about 30 founding members, which was a reasonably good result um, for 2011. But it was quite difficult to grow it from there. Um, Through 2011 to 2014, 2015. It was a very slow, gradual process. It was difficult to convince companies to part with even a kind of a small membership fee. Um, it wasn't really quite there. The industry was still in shock, and they weren't quite buying into sustainability quite yet back then either.
And how was that? How has it been that evolution until 2023, where we are at? Because you said 2015, 16 being difficult. I can see now more and more interest about the work IGBC does, and also the number of members that are joining
Yeah, but I suppose
IGBC.
there's a couple of things. It actually takes it takes a while for an organization to build up a kind of a body of work that they become. Because initially members are buying into something, they can't see any outputs, and it takes a while to build up a body of work. So that's why we started from 2015 onwards, a couple of years where we started to produce interesting work. People became a little bit more interested. Um, and we became more visible. But then there was a real step change from 2019 onwards and probably 2020. So, from 2019, 2020 onwards, you just suddenly saw a huge increase in interest with, everybody from developers, which we weren't seeing much traction early on. We said we had no developers. Um, and suddenly we had a lot of interest. All of the main developers started to join. Um, More interest from architects as well. We hadn't had a huge interest from architects, funnily enough. We would have expected that, but we saw a lot of architects join. And I think COVID had a big impact. During 2020, the lockdown, we were saying, oh, how's this going to impact us? In fact, it didn't. We saw membership just take off 2020, 21, 2022. And it was it was quite surprising for us that. But this was reflected across Europe as well. A lot of countries across Europe started to see an increase in interest as well. But particularly in Ireland, I think we were probably seeing a huge level of growth.
I think you're definitely doing a great job, and I personally collaborate with IGBC on a number of things, and it's good to see that all the people want to help and collaborate and engage. And I agree there are other GBCs across Europe and across the world, but I think in particular IGBC are doing some really good work and webinars and trainings that are there. You get attendance from other parts of the world, not only from Ireland. So that's I guess that's a really good endorsement for your team as well to see that happening because that's that you're doing a good job. So that's happening at IGBC, and so that means you are in the right direction. How you see that? Have you seen a similar evolution in the construction industry in Ireland happening, or you think it's that construction is still going in a different way, not following the progress that IGBC are doing?
No, well, I suppose um, we have seen really a step change in what um, companies are doing. I mean, I suppose back in 2013, World Green Building Council released the business case for green building, um, and that was the first. It was quite a it was an attempt to make the business case. So um, we still had to make that business case in 2013, and in 2014 they released a report on health, um, and that was a way of really making the business case, because the business case on energy efficiency um, wasn't really as strong as, because it's such a tiny percentage of a company's output. But the health and well-being one had a much more significant impact on construction, on productivity in an office. So they were still trying. We were still trying to make the case on business case, whereas what happened 2019 and 2020, I think it was a transition more to, it's not just about the business case, it's actually about saving humanity's future. And I think the penny dropped there. And that's where um, companies were also being forced, I suppose, by investors to actually take this seriously. And that's where the real step
Hmm.
change occurred.
I agree with that. Investors is a really good point. I've been asking the last week twice about how can this evolve quicker, and I think investment is important. So if the investors have that in mind, that sustainability has to be at the core of the design, that's a huge win, because then that all the actors will get involved. So I think to mention probably one, not change, but one important point at IGBC was the launch of the roadmap to decarbonize Ireland. So could you tell us a bit more about that and what it meant, and when you started working on it? It was launched last week, and since then there has been a lot of work done along that.
Yeah, building a zero carbon Ireland was a roadmap we developed. We started so it's a roadmap to fully decarbonise the built environment across its full life cycle by 2050. So we started working on that in 20, um, 20 early 2021, and launched it in October last year. So um, that was really bringing together all of the stakeholders involved in construction. I think there was over 200 organisations involved, and mapping out what we needed to do to get to zero. But it was very much underpinned, because we had to find what the baseline um, for construction and buildings was in Ireland. We didn't have that data. So we commissioned UCD to carry out a report for us to actually put numbers on it. Um, because quite often when we had talked, say, around whole life carbon with government, the response was, well, is it really such a big issue? I mean, what you're giving us global figures that embodied carbon, for example, is 11% of global emissions. Um, but is it that really the case in Ireland? So we were able to come back. No, it's not 11%; it's 14% in Ireland. So it's even more. And I think that was a real wake-up call for everybody if we hadn't really accounted for this properly before.
That's very interesting. But thank you for that. And you made reference to something that's very important as well. That's all the actors that need. That's not that roadmap, and the work you do is obviously not something you could do in isolation as IGBC. So you need to. I think, or I guess, an important part of your job is bring all these actors. You refer earlier to 200 over 200 companies. So can you tell us a bit how is that? How is your job about bringing all these people and companies
Yeah, and I
together?
suppose that's the whole concept of green building councils. It's we couldn't sit in splendid isolation, coming up with um, policy recommendations. It's always about involving everybody in the kind of the entire kind of value chain. So what's the investor perspective? What's the designer's perspective? What's the construction products manufacturer's perspective? And it's only when you get them all talking to each other that you actually get recommendations that are robust. Because otherwise, there can be a lot of the circle of blame of different different sectors blaming the other, and it's only when you can get them all into one room and um, talk to each other and talk through what their issues are that you can actually come up with a robust solutions that that'll help deliver change. So
That's very interesting, Pat. And I think collaboration is a key word there, isn't it? And bringing all those people. And can you tell us about how that is organized and the webinars and the workshops that IGBC organized for that to happen?
well, I suppose we have done this a number of times over the years. We've done it around on we had developed experience in doing kind of large scale stakeholder engagement around the national renovation strategy. So we took a similar approach, and it's about identifying everybody um, in different sectors, who could help. So initially, what we did is we drew up a couple of briefing papers on topics like construction supply chain, education, um, policy, public procurement, planning, and then we invited um, respective kind of fairly broad range of people to separate workshops on these thematic areas to input into that and input into the key recommendations in each of those areas. So you're trying to make it as broad as possible, and what you don't want you want to ensure that you don't get groupthink, or you don't get it doesn't become an echo chamber where you've got the same type of people in the room. That you have enough people that will push back on other viewpoints, so that they have to kind of work through an issue and figure out, okay, if somebody said, well, you should do this, then it could be government or it could be a procurer say, well, we can't, that won't work because that's not how that's not how we do things, or that's not how we can do things, but you could do this instead. And that way you get a more robust policy recommendation.
Mhm. Yeah, that's. And have you seen since the roadmap and also all these events that you've organized and workshops, the feedback from the government, and are they keen to implement all those learnings and recommendations more than they were 2 3 years ago?
Well, I think it has moved along considerably. Within the Climate Action Plan 2022, there's a lot more recommendations on embodied carbon and whole life carbon in there. If you looked at the 2019 climate action plan, there was virtually nothing in there on whole life carbon, whereas now 2022, there's some very clear recommendations in there, particularly around public procurement. There's some actions that have to be delivered this year around integrating, reducing embodied carbon of construction products.
And you talked earlier that in Ireland it's 14% of the carbon emissions, which is obviously a lot. So how do you see that working for the future? How can that be enforced, or how can that be? How can How can we make sure that that happens and we get those embodied carbon levels down in Ireland?
Well, I suppose it's a combination of things. I suppose we said at kind of a broad at a broader level what the strategy has to be. It can't just be about looking at the individual building and looking at per square meter reductions. You actually have to take a broader view, because Ireland as a country is its population is growing. So we're going to be building an awful lot more than maybe some other countries. So uh, construction output is set to increase very, very significantly over the next 10 years. So the challenge is, how do you reduce embodied carbon by 50% in 7 or 8 years, whilst at the same time increasing output? And that means you have to take a broader view. It's not just reducing the carbon intensity. You really have to have some adult conversations about what we're building, and um, the whole area of demolition, the whole area of making better use of our existing stock, using vacant space, and getting more out of what we already have. And then when you move on to um, planning buildings, you're planning them for that inbuilt flexibility. Um, you're planning for efficiencies. You know, you're not just building. You're planning them for the long term, and you're planning for them to be able to maximize the usage of them as well. Um, use intensity, etc.
I, that, that's a that's a very good point, but that you said about intensity and flexibility and all that, because we tend to focus, and we've been focusing a lot on embodied carbon and whole life carbon, which, of course, I agree, it's very important. But maybe we are not looking at other metrics that are as important or even more, because something that I refer to often is the size of the properties, whether it's commercial or residential. It doesn't matter. Because if it has a low embodied carbon, but it's a per square meter, which is the metric we use normally, but it's a very large property, that's different. But at the moment, there is no metrics for that that I'm aware of. So is that something you are looking at, or IGBC are looking at, or part of levels in Europe?
Well, I suppose levels set out 6 macro objectives. So you know, you have macro objective 2, which is about global warming. Sorry, macro objective 1 is global warming across the whole life cycle. But macro objective 2 is resources and circularity. So it sets out. So you have to measure your whole life carbon, but you also the indicators in resources and circularity are around how much resources are you using. There's 4. How you've designed for adaptability. So can the building be adapted over its lifetime to change of use? Is it easily adapted for change of use, so it doesn't have to be demolished? And designed for disassembly. So how is it designed? And there's checklists for how you design for deconstruction, and it's also an indicator around waste. Now, I suppose the challenging bit is that there are contradictions between whole life carbon and circularity, because sometimes if you're designing for adaptability, you might want to have slightly higher floor to ceiling heights, or you might want to have maybe wider grids, structural grids. So there can sometimes be trade-offs. So it's really, how do you account for both and make the best decision?
And the loads, I think, an important. I was told a few weeks ago by a contractor that they were asked, they were retrofitting a building, and because it was designed with a use, and then they, when changing the use, it meant the structure wasn't didn't have enough redundancy. So that didn't make it as easy as it could have been if there were more redundancy built in. But that's, as you said, against the going for a lower whole life carbon. So it's, I guess it's not as easy. So it's keep researching, I guess, and working on that. But definitely interesting. The other thing as well is on the methodology. So IGBC are also doing a lot of work on the methodology to calculate that whole life carbon we were talking about, to ensure that all the actors and all the parties are using same methodology, so we can compare like for like. So could you tell us a bit more about that and how IGBC are working, and again aligning with the European
Yes,
standards?
well, one of the challenges that is that at the moment everybody's calculating whole life carbon, but they may be using different assumptions, different data. So what we're trying to do that for Ireland is have one national methodology that also includes kind of defaults, so that it removes some of the um, ambiguity about what defaults you're using. If you don't have, for example, an EPD, what data do you use? What data do you use, say, for um, what assumptions do you make for end of life? What assumptions do you make for, say, on-site activities, say the A4 site activities, or the A5 activities, or the A4 transport? Because if everybody is using slightly different assumptions, there's more scope for gaming it, and you're going to get different results, and you can't really compare them. So we're trying to standardize that, but also it fully aligned with levels, so that the was you have to it has to be aligned with levels. You will need those national defaults and data just to make it comparable at a national level.
Yeah, that I think that that standardization and accuracy that you refer to, it's very important, because one of the criticisms I hear more is about that inaccuracy, and kind of that anyone can tweak the data so to kind of show the picture that you want. So definitely having that alignment would help a lot. Also to demonstrate that is something that is accurate. So then there is less, you know, people saying, well, why should we do it if it's not accurate enough? So the an important role there are the EPDs, as you said earlier. And I see every week that on the IGBC newsletter or the website or wherever on social media, more and more companies are developing EPDs. So can you tell us about that, and how is that progressing and growing in Ireland in particular?
Yeah, I think Irish manufacturers have really taken to producing APDs. Like we doubled the number of EPDs in 2022 from 2023, which had doubled from the previous year. So they're
Yeah, that's
growing all of the time, and it seems to be becoming well accepted now in the industry that you have to produce one, and probably more so even than in the UK and possibly some of the European countries. It has been quite successful, and we expect it to grow significantly in 2023 and 2024 again.
That's really good news, because the more EPDs and the more data we have, the better. And that aligns with what we said earlier about what you said about having that um, standards and the average. So if you have those EPDs and at the same time the IGBC are creating those average data for on-site and things, that hopefully will give us the basis to prepare more accurate LCAs. So about circularity, you mentioned earlier, that's very important as well. And about waste in particular, if you read the research on all the figures that we get, similar to embodied carbon, that's around 11% worldwide. on waste, there are research that say that between 10-15% of virgin products or materials go directly to waste because they are not used in the construction, they directly waste. So can you tell us a bit more about that and what IGBC are proposing in Ireland to prevent that happening?
Well, I suppose we're working on a couple of initiatives at the moment on waste. As well, one thing we did launch in December was the Construction Materials Exchange. Sorry, the CMEX, which is around offering a a location. So that's the one practical thing we are doing. So it's an exchange platform. There are other issues. So there's other barriers like, for example, the application of the European Waste Framework in Ireland, which is monitored by or which is licensed by the EPA. How we license end of waste, because if a product is coming off, or a waste product is coming off site, um, it can it is designated a waste once it leaves the site, even if it could be used somewhere else, unless it's licensed for reuse as a byproduct. And that is kind of blocking a lot of reuse of, particularly of aggregates and soils even. Um, and it creates a lot of uncertainty even around products that could be directly reused from a site. So that's a policy area that we want to do a lot more work on, and we're going to be starting a similar process to building life in the new year. We're going to be developing a circularity roadmap um, in the next year. So, well, we've also done we've done quite a few. We've been trying to understand as well the design process and how um, design teams integrate circularity. So in the past year, we were looking at circularity statements. We were piloting circularity statements with design teams in Ireland and seeing how did that impact on their approach to design.
I think that's all moving in the right direction, but at the same time, we have a limited time to work to, and 2050. And we have the 1.5 degrees and everything. So, what's your feeling about the progress we are making and the speed at which that change is happening, and the objectives we have to
Well,
meet?
there's I suppose there's an Irish saying that if you're trying to get to 2050, I wouldn't start from here. But I think we are making progress. It would have been good if we'd started 10 years ago, but I think we are making quite significant progress. We're not quite on target. We're probably well off target, but I think we are making significant progress. I think industry has now fully bought into it. Government has fully bought into it. So now it's down to, can we get the level of collaboration, the speed of change that is necessary to deliver it? And I think we possibly could. I think there's the I think there's the I think there's the impetus now, and I don't think anybody's arguing against it anymore.
That's very positive, Pat. So, and just to finish, one thing is there, if you could say something to all those actors, stakeholders in the construction industry in Ireland, what would be that message that you would send to them?
Well, I think it's really to embrace this now, to embrace the change, because it's going to be it's going to be going at breakneck speed over the next 10 years. So the more education, upskilling you can do now and get to understand those changes that are coming down the road, the better.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always, and thanks a lot for joining us
Thank you,
today.
Juan, and thanks for having me on.